Can the MAX OC RTX 5080 beat the RTX 4090? Well, I was curious about this comparison, so I tested these two graphics cards in 23 games to find out the answer. Let's discuss that in this video.
Hey, if you enjoy content like this, drop a like, make sure to subscribe, and smash that bell so you never miss another video.
Hey, what is going on, guys? Danny here. Welcome back to the channel, and I hope you've all been doing well. A couple of months ago, I reviewed the MSI RTX 5080 Expert, and I found that overall it was a pretty nice graphics card with a unique design, from an AIB that is. It was inspired by Nvidia's previous generation Founders series. I also tackled undervolting and power limiting the card, which resulted in some massive efficiency gains. I'll have links to those videos down below if you're interested in checking that out. However, for this video, what I wanted to do was something even more fun and tackle a topic or comparison that's been on my mind for a while now. As you all know, Nvidia's previous generation flagship, the RTX 4090, is not being produced anymore. And you can't really find it at any major retailers in stock unless it's a rare open boxed or it's a refurbished card that they're looking to just flip. And the RTX 4090, it's still a beast of a graphics card, and arguably a lot of people consider it to be the second fastest gaming graphics card on the planet. But if you wanted to attain this level of performance and you wanted to buy a new graphics card, at a first glance it looks like that's impossible to do. So that's the itch that I wanted to scratch. If you can't reasonably buy a brand new RTX 4090 anymore, is a max overclocked RTX 5080 the real world stand-in, or even the smarter play in this case? Once you push both of the graphics cards to their limits, on paper, stock versus stock only tells part of the story. But in the real world, contrary to what larger mainstream tech tubers will tell you, people like to tune their hardware, at least with my channel's following. Power limits, curve optimizer, memory overclocking, and even thermal tweaking, all of that can work. And the headroom can really reshuffle the stack there if, you're able to achieve that. And there's another layer here that, makes this comparison actually useful for the, guys watching. Modern games are all over the place. We've got heavy RT pipelines, varied CPU threading upscalers, frame gen muddying the waters, etc. Plus, wildly different memory footprints from title to title. Some of you may be purely shopping for just pure raster performance. Some may actually prefer to game with RT enabled, and a lot of you actually care about performance per watt, noise, and temps just as much as raw FPS, right? So instead of a quick bar chart duel, I built a 23 benchmark suite with a dedicated ray tracing section to show where each card wins, how it wins, and what that means for your next possible upgrade. Quick ground rules before we dive in. Both of the GPUs are pushed to what I consider, daily drivable max OCs using MSI Afterburner with consistent power and thermal limits, same drivers and identical game settings across the board. Silicon lottery is for sure real. Your results may shift a couple of percent either way depending on your card's sample, but this should paint a pretty clear picture of what can be achievable. If a tuned RTX 5080 can consistently trade blows with a tuned RTX 4090, that's a big deal for anyone trying to get top tier performance without playing the used or refurbished roulette. Also, have you guys lately seen what used RTX 4090s are going for? The prices are absolutely insane. They're selling for well above MSRP. This is a graphics card that was released in late 2022. And the reason for this is because these graphics cards are still highly sought after by AI farms. So it's just not worth it. It's just not feasible for your average high-end gamer. Before we jump into the benchmarks, I wanted to go over some specifications for both of these graphics cards and also do a rundown of my test system specifications. Starting with the GPUs, the 5080 is powered by Blackwell's GB203, and the 4090 is based on Ada Lovelace 8102, both on TSMC's 4nm. But they get there in different ways. The 4090 is the brute force part with more everything: 16,384 CUDA cores, 128 3rd-gen RT cores, and 512 4th-generation Tensor cores, plus a wider memory system with 24GB of GDDR6X on a 384-bit bus running at 21 gigabits per second. The RTX 5080 comes in leaner: 10,752 CUDA cores, 84 4th-generation RT cores, 336 5th-generation Tensor cores, yet it's the newer architecture and it pairs with the faster GDDR7 at 30 gigabits per second Even on a 256-bit bus, it lands roughly in the same bandwidth class while drawing less power in terms of its stock performance. Out of the box, both of these graphics cards will boost in the 2.6 to 2.7 GHz range, but this isn't a stock for stock comparison that I will be doing. I've overclocked both of these graphics cards using MSI Afterburner, as I believe this will show us the full picture. For the RTX 4090, I have it running at around 3000 MHz with a plus 1500 memory offset, and the RTX 5080 is running at around 3200 MHz with a plus 3000 MHz offset, as GDDR7 can be pushed much further, allowing for effectively 36 GB of bandwidth. For the test system specifications, we'll be testing on my 14900K system, where I have it power tuned, where the CPU can maintain its stock boost clocks. I've also got a slight bump on the E-cores, and the ring is running at 5 GHz. It's paired with 48 GB of DDR5 memory clocked at 8000 CL36, running on the MSI Z790M Power motherboard. All of the games are stored on a 4TB Corsair MP600 Pro LPX NVMe SSD. You guys can check the video description for full system specs. All the games were tested at 4K with high settings, with the exception of just one title. With that said, let's get into our first benchmark, and that's Dying Light the Beast. Both cards deliver smooth performance and gameplay at 4K. However, the RTX 4090 shows a clear advantage, providing roughly a 12% lead in both average frame rate and 1% lows compared to the RTX 5080. In practice, that means that the RTX 4090 keeps you comfortably north of the 90 FPS mark, while the 5080 hangs just under it. Both are excellent, but the Ada card has a touch more breathing room for those sudden combat spikes. The next game on our list is a new one. This is Cronos the New Dawn, and here there's a similar story. The 4090 pulls ahead by just over 11% on average and around 10% on the lows. Both cards are able to maintain FPS around the 60 FPS mark, so unless you're pushing a 144Hz display at 4K, you'd be hard-pressed to notice the difference, but technically the 4090 has the upper hand here. Things flip in Expedition 33. This one actually favors the RTX 5080 by about 4% on the averages and a little over 3% in the 1% lows. That's still within margin of error where you won't feel a night and day difference, yet it's notable because it shows how Blackwell's newer architecture can edge out Ada in certain engines. Nonetheless, they're both providing decent performance at 4K. Moving on, and we have my game of the year, and that is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. The RTX 4090 stretches its legs, posting about a 10% lead in the average FPS and roughly 8% better lows. Both GPUs render lush medieval forests above 100 FPS at 4K, but the 4090's wider memory bus and extra shaders translate into tighter frame pacing when you gallop into dense towns. It's not an unplayable result for the 5080 by any means, still totally smooth, you just get a bit more headroom with the older flagship. Marvel Rivals ends up being nearly a dead heat between the two cards. The 4090 is only about 4% faster on the average, while the RTX 5080 actually edges it out slightly on the 1% lows. In other words, you're looking at around 100 FPS either way. You would need a benchmark overlay to tell them apart, so both cards make the game feel buttery smooth. For Oblivion Remastered, it's practically a draw. The 4090 shows a slight 4 to 5% lead on both averages and lows, while in the real world, it translates to just a few frames. Neither card is anywhere near its VRAM limit in this remake with the settings that I was using, and the experience is indistinguishable. Smooth, stable, and highly playable on either GPU. At this point, I'm just throwing Monster Hunter Wilds in my benchmark suite to showcase an unoptimized abomination, and when devs try to leverage an engine that's not really suitable for their game. In terms of performance, the RTX 4090 holds a 9% lead for both the average FPS and 1% lows, but come on, for this kind of graphical visual fidelity, I'd expect a lot more from both of these graphics cards. In Call of Duty Black Ops 6, the margin shrinks again. The 4090 is about 3% faster on averages, and 7% on the 1% lows, but both GPUs pump out well over 200 FPS. With the numbers that high, the difference between them really wouldn't be noticeable. You're essentially getting esports level performance from either card, with the 4090 holding a slightly better advantage in terms of the lows. Indianna Jones in the Great Circle sees a similar small gap. The 4090 is roughly 3.5% faster on average and just under 5% better in the lows. For a single-player title like this, you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference between these two GPUs. In this intro scene where there's lots of dense foliage, both are running very stable. It's kind of weird saying this, but Cyberpunk 2077 is the oldest title in my benchmark suite now. but I still like including it considering its popularity, how well it runs, and hey, it's an awesome game. At 4K high, it has both of the cards neck and neck. The RTX 4090 is only about 2% ahead on average and barely 1% on the lows, making this effectively a tie. Both cards keeping Night City north of 100 FPS. Spider-Man 2 is where the 4090 shows a more noticeable edge. The older flagship delivers about a 10% uplift in both average and 1% lows, which translates to the difference between the high 120s to the low 140s. With its wider memory bus and higher shader count, the 4090 handles busy cityscapes and swinging sequences with more cushion, though the 5080 still offers a overall fluid experience, though I would prefer the 1% lows to be better. However, with multiple patches, the devs still can't resolve that. The next game we have is Hogwarts Legacy, and here we can see that while the average FPS between both GPUs is almost a tie, the lows in the 4090 are about 9% better overall. In any case, both of these GPUs handle this game well with the settings cranked to high, so you'll have an enjoyable experience either way. Moving on, and we have another single-player adventure, and that is Horizon Forbidden West. Here, the difference between the two cards was larger than I had expected. 10% for the average FPS and 9% for the 1% lows in favor for the RTX 4090. With that said, the RTX 5080's performance was still totally playable. Alan Wake 2 is up next, and here the RTX 4090 is ahead by about 7% on the average and roughly 3% in the 1% lows. So the 4090 is probably able to edge it out due to the wider bus and higher shader count, though it's not a dramatic difference like it is on the spec sheet. The 5080 stays comfortably playable, but it runs closer to its limit with the render stack effects. Nothing dramatic, just a small repeatable margin for Ada again. In Black Myth Wukong, this one is effectively a tie. The 4090 is up 2% on the averages and about 1% on the lows. Both cards hold frame time very cleanly, and neither is VRAM pressured with the settings that I was using. If you are watching the overlay, the two lines track almost on top of each other. Any preference here really just comes down to efficiency versus capacity rather than the performance itself. In The Last of Us Part 2, again a very small spread. The 4090 leads by about 2% average and 1% in the lows. Both GPUs keep the game well above the comfort zone, so you won't feel a real difference outside a chart. Raster throughput, not memory capacity, is doing the work here, and they're both very strong. Call it a practical draw with a slight nod to the 4090. Stalker 2 is next, and the 4090 carries a modest 4% advantage on the averages and 5% on the lows. In busy firefights, that translates into a slightly firmer floor. The 5080's newer RT/tensor blocks don't really factor in this raster run, so it's mainly shader count and bandwidth pulling more FPS. Still totally smooth on both sides either way. Moving on to Space Marine 2, the story is similar. We see a slight advantage in favor of the RTX 4090, 4% for the average FPS and 5% on the 1% lows. So the 5080 is trailing pretty much right behind it, and is able to offer virtually the same experience as the previous generation flagship. Up next, we have Baldurs Gate 3, and this game really surprised me because I was expecting it to be pretty much a tie here considering how CPU-bound this game can be, but since we are at 4K, I guess the GPU differences do come into play here, but I still wasn't expecting to see the 4090 pull ahead by around 9% on the average FPS and 15% on the 1% lows, so pretty significant differences here between the two cards. Next, we have Liza P, and since the devs released the DLC for this game this past summer, there's been a lot of reported issues with people experiencing stuttering and poor frame time consistency, especially with the RTX 50 series, and I did experience that for myself. Testing in DX11 for the 5080 does help a bit, but the lows really aren't as high as I'd like them to be or as they were before. Regardless, both GPUs in their tests performed similarly. In Remnant 2, the 4090 steps back in front by about 7% on averages and 3% on the lows. The advantage shows up during the big particle-heavy encounters where extra raster throughput helps. The 5080 still keeps things pretty playable across the board, but a minor and repeatable win for the 4090. The next game we have is Starfield, and this was another title where we saw a large difference in favor of the previous generation flagship, where the 4090 was 14% faster in the average and 1% low FPS stats. With that said, the 5080 is still able to average around 100 FPS, which for a single-player title like this one, it's more than ample. The last game on our list is A Plague Tale Requiem, another single-player story-driven adventure where both GPUs deliver great performance with the settings cranked to high. The 4090 does pull ahead, though it's a slight advantage of 3% on the average and 6% on the 1% lows. So taking a look at our 23 game average, not surprised by the end result here given what we saw from all of the games. When both of these GPUs are overclocked, at least according to my samples, they're basically neck and neck here when it comes to raster performance. But do keep in mind, some games do actually use software RT, such as Indianna Jones and Black Myth Wukong. The RTX 4090 in terms of stats is 6% faster on average, and also the 1% lows. That's measurable on a chart, sure, but in terms of real-world gameplay, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between these two GPUs for the most part. We'll discuss this more in our conclusion, but next, what I wanted to share with you guys was some ray tracing benchmarks, path tracing results with some upscaling involved. And for this segment of the video, I'm just going to quickly go over some charts as I only tested 6 games here. The first game is Cronos The New Dawn, and the RTX 5080 pulls ahead here, which is certainly interesting because in our raster benchmark, the 4090 was ahead. So we're looking at a 5% advantage for the 5080 in the average, and 16% for the 1% lows, which is a pretty big swing. The next game we have is Oblivion Remastered, and this one is basically a tie for the average FPS, with the 5080 providing slightly higher 1% lows, but this is really just margin of error stuff. Moving on, and we have Indianna Jones in the Great Circle with path tracing enabled. This is where things flip, and it's the 4090 that pulls ahead by 18% for the average FPS and 17% for the 1% lows. In Cyberpunk 2077 with path tracing enabled, we see the same story play out. The 4090 is ahead by 15% for the average FPS and 18% for the 1% lows. It's worth pointing out though that the 5080 does actually support X3 and X4 frame gen, so it would yield a smoother looking gameplay result, but with a base frame rate around 46 FPS, I don't think it would feel all that great. So I tweaked settings further to get it closer to around 70 FPS and then add frame gen on top. The next 2 games that we have, the story just continues, where with path tracing involved, it's the 4090 that pulls ahead and maintains the performance advantage in both Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong. So there you guys have it. Now going through these results, depending on the perspective you look at things, you may have a negative or a positive outlook on the results seen here. Starting with the negative, it sucks to see that an 80 class from the current generation is not able to hold a sizable lead over the previous generation flagship. Because if you go back and compare the RTX 4080 to the 3090 Ti, there was a pretty significant and noticeable gap there. The 3080 was also quite a bit faster than the 2080 Ti by, a considerable margin. I know with Turing things were a little bit of a flop, but reliably the 2080 was edging out the 1080 Ti, albeit not at that large margin we'd liked it to happen. But then if you look at the 1080 and then you compared it to the 980 Ti, you see a much larger gap there, and so on and so forth. You guys get the picture. Here the RTX 4090 is overall faster than the RTX 5080. So this has never actually happened before. So if this trend does continue, then the 6080 is definitely not going to be faster than a 5090 in terms of, raw raster performance. Now, if you look at things in a more positive outlook, in the vast majority of titles, this deficit was actually only seen on paper. And if you actually gamed on both of these cards, you wouldn't be able to perceive any sort of difference because for the most part, they were just single-digit differences. And don't forget, the RTX 4090 was overclocked as well. So if you're someone who's after, stock 4090 performance, like that is the level of performance you're going to be satisfied with, then you'll be happy to know that once you tune in RTX 5080, it can certainly deliver that. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is because of the fact that you cannot buy a brand new RTX 4090 anymore. And if you look at the used market for what they're selling for, it's well above MSRP, and like I said before, they're still highly sought after by AI farms. And it's because of that 24 gigabytes of VRAM that the 4090 offers, along with that 384-bit bus. It just doesn't make sense for your average high-end gamer to go for that. So either way you look at it, if you want to attain close to that 4090 level of performance, you're gonna have to go with the 5080. The other positive, I guess, is that if you can find a 5080 in stock, well, you should be able to because it's readily available in stock and it's now selling for MSRP. And in some instances this past month, I have seen it drop below MSRP as far as even $100 below MSRP. So I mean, $900 and you can get 4090 level like performance. Depending on how you look at it, pretty decent deal, I think. Furthermore, you do get other advantages with the 5080, right? Newer features like X3 and X4 frame gen, which the 4090 does not support if you need to rely on that sort of stuff. And it has the updated Blackwell encoders, which could perform better in some media creation programs. if you are dabbling into, content creation. Along with that, the 5080 does offer the efficiency advantage, though I'm not sure how much the consumer in this high-end segment would really be caring about that kind of stuff. But, just another benefit to point out with the new Blackwell card. But all in all, this is a pretty interesting comparison, so that's going to be doing it for this one. Hope you all enjoyed. We'll touch base in the next video.
If you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining, then leave a like. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. Be sure to check out the video description for cool links and ways to support the channel, such as using my Amazon affiliate link. And if you're interested in seeing more content like this, then consider subscribing. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.